Hello, Jack here, and today I'm finally both appropriately diagnosed and medicated for ADHD. Medication has done some great things for me, but apparently it has not made me great at pumping out videos. So that's, I guess, a bit of a shame, but everything else is going great, and I did finish this one, which is a long time in the making, and also, if I'm honest, a lot longer in length than I intended, but I refused to cut any more of it out because I already split like 2 subjects I wanted to talk about here into their own potential future videos, and I'm not going to do it again. So today I'm going to talk about something I have been trying to write a script about for many months now, because I think it's a subject that is very important, albeit a bit uncomfortable, and this is passing tips. Specifically, why passing tips don't usually work. Now, having been a pre-T trans man who was obsessed with these passing tips for many years, I can kind of anticipate that this statement might make some people a bit defensive, so I want to be clear that I am not saying that you can't or should not change your gender expression, that you can't use passing tips advice if you have experienced benefits from it, that passing itself is inherently bad, or that nobody is able to pass without hormones at all. What I'm saying is that for most trans men, the reason we don't pass before we get on testosterone is because of physiological traits that we have very little control over. With gender expression, which is what passing tips tackle usually, playing a relatively minor role that can't meaningfully balance out those physiological traits in most trans men. In addition, the lore surrounding this, what I've been calling passing tips lore, has had long-term negative consequences for many of us within the trans male community, and I think that we need to talk about that. It's very important for this video that we all are on the same page when I say the word passing. In the trans community, we have long used the term passing as sort of shorthand for getting gendered correctly, and that's led to a bizarre misunderstanding in which a lot of trans people think that passing is like passing a test. I've seen a lot of discourse suggesting that we should not use that term because it's like giving a gold star A+ to trans people who look a particular way and then telling people who don't that they fail. That's not really what passing means, though. Passing, in a sociological sense, means that you're able to convince people that you are something that you aren't. It's used in a lot of marginalized communities and comes from the same terminology you'd use to describe something like counterfeit money. If you have a bill that looks real enough to spend it at a store with nobody noticing, you are passing a counterfeit bill as a real one. This is why when you, as a trans man, say something like, "I passed as a man today," or ask, "How can I pass as male better?" that's an incorrect use of the term passing, and that's because trans men cannot pass as men. That's something that we already are. In trans men, what passing means is that people believe that we are cis men. They interpret us as men based on factors like appearance, but are not able to readily tell that we are trans. So when I say that passing tips don't work, I'm not saying that they have no redeeming qualities at all. What I'm saying is that the ability to pass as a cis man is largely biologically determined. It's something that you either are naturally able to do on account of things like genetics, or it's something that you develop with the aid of hormones, surgery, or both. The passing tips lore that tries telling us that trans men can just follow a bunch of life hack style passing tips we found on the internet and then magically pass as cis men is largely a myth, and in my opinion, it's a toxic myth that we should be actively challenging. Lest you believe that I am merely gloating about being a super great passing trans man who has all the hormones now, I'm going to start off by telling you a bit about my own history, because my opinions on this are heavily informed by the fact that I was a non-passing trans man for the full 8 years of my life between coming out as trans in 2003 and going on hormones in 2011. So I would occasionally experience small fleeting moments where a stranger might call me sir, but beyond that, I was almost universally seen and treated as a woman outside of the queer community, and it's really important to understand that at this time the trans male community, at least the part of the community that I had experience with, really bought the idea that the way to get people to stop misgendering you was to pass. It wasn't to correct people or advocate for yourself. Pronoun pins weren't really a thing at that point. You were supposed to pass by eliminating all of these subtle feminine gender cues that clearly were a part of your expression, and you were supposed to aggressively distinguish yourself from butch lesbians by avoiding styles associated with them. So I spent a lot of time on what is now f2mpassingtips.com. I could recite almost verbatim the advice found on that website and others like it, and through that advice I became very aware of things like whether or not I had pointy sideburns, how big my watch faces were in comparison to the size of my wrist, the way that I looked at my fingernails, the way that I crossed my arms and legs or used the bathroom, and many other things that passing tips lists tend to focus on as potential reasons why a trans man might not be passing. Using those passing tips, I changed many things about myself, like again, how I looked at my fingernails, how I walked, how I held books, how I got my hair cut, the clothing I wore, and I also tried really hard to change the way that I talked. None of that advice ever stopped the deluge of misgendering, so I'd look at more passing tips lists, trying to find out what the problem was, and change more things about myself and the way that I presented myself, and that wouldn't work either, so the cycle would continue. I was in a position where my friends and close acquaintances didn't misgender me because they all knew me well enough, but as soon as I ventured beyond the queer community, again, I was, for almost all intents and purposes, still living as a woman, and I knew it was going to be many years before I'd be able to access testosterone, so this was an enormous mental health burden. I would seek emotional support from my friends, and one thing that happened often enough that it still stresses me out a lot to this day to think about it, was that my friends, and most specifically my best friend at the time, would often take any complaint I had about the inability to pass as an opportunity to neg me about the fact that I wore earrings. I'd be blowing off steam because I had to deal with being called she all day, and they'd reply with something like, well, the earrings don't help. And it often felt like this friend just brought up the earrings for no reason other than it bothered them that I continued to wear a feminine thing. So I was going to get emotional support and leaving stressed out because instead of support, I was basically just getting picked on for not conforming to traditional masculinity well enough. I'm not here to demonize this friend. I did want to pass and they knew it. And there's a lot of unpacked baggage and trauma there that is not one-sided in any way, but what's important to this story is how I felt at the time, and I felt like I couldn't really confide in anybody about one of my biggest sources of depression and anxiety, because if I did, they would just give me more passing tips and essentially blame me for being misgendered because I didn't conform to male stereotypes well enough. My friend, who was presenting as a cis man at this time, had the utmost freedom to wear things like eyeliner and Hot Topic kilts that looked straight up like schoolgirl skirts, but when I wore earrings that were marketed specifically as men's earrings, it was a big problem. I continued to wear earrings throughout college because even at my lowest self-confidence levels, I'm super stubborn, but the commentary nonetheless planted a lot of hurtful seeds in my psyche, and this is why something as simple as a friend expressing mild disapproval of my earrings bothers me so much when I think about it today, over 10 years later. I'd really become convinced that they were correct. I felt almost guilty because I had internalized the idea that the reason that I didn't pass, and by extension the reason I was going through the trauma of constant misgendering, was because I couldn't let go of this one stupid piece of self-expression. Eventually, after I graduated, I was having a really hard time getting a job, and there were a lot of reasons for that, but I really zeroed in on the fact that I didn't pass as the potential linchpin of the whole operation. It was in that context that I bit the bullet and took them out for the remaining couple of years between graduating university and getting on testosterone. And folks, with that singular action, my life was transformed. No longer would people see me and think I was some earrings-wearing butch lesbian. Oh no! They instead started seeing me as a butch lesbian who didn't wear earrings. I passed exactly 0% better and got exactly 0% benefit from doing this. And in retrospect, it's really not that hard to see why. If we look at what I looked like pre-T, I was in my third year of university at this photo, which is around the time the earring story happened, maybe a little bit earlier than that. If I post this photograph in any passing tips forum, they're going to tell me the exact same thing my friend did. It's obviously the earrings, you should take them out. But here, let me let you in on a little secret. You ready? Come closer. Closer than that. The earrings aren't why I don't pass. It's the estrogen. If we use some digital wizardry to take the earrings out of this photograph, I still don't pass. And it's not just speculation, because I recognize the dorm room that I'm in as being the very location that I had just re-pierced my ears after 2 years of not wearing them. See, after I came out as trans, like that couple years earlier, I took the earrings out, assuming that that's what I was supposed to do, and I can tell you that I did not pass at any point prior to wearing those earrings. The reason I don't pass during the time this photo was taken has nothing to do with what I'm wearing. It's not because of my hair, it's not because I look at my fingernails wrong, or whatever other mannerisms some passing tips list taught you were bad things only girls do. It's because I spent my entire puberty and every year since then soaking in a big vat of estrogen, which had a dramatic effect on my physiological features. Estrogen affected the shape of my face. Estrogen affected the shape of my whole body. Estrogen affected my skin quality, and estrogen made me sound like this.
So I was a freshman in college part 1.
These were all things that I didn't have a whole lot of control over outside of eventually going on testosterone. So while those life hack style passing tips I was so into may have helped mitigate my dysphoria a bit, they simply were not capable of offsetting the effects of so many years of estrogen, enough for me to really genuinely be able to pass at that point in my life. So again, they weren't useless, but it's still a hell of a problem. They are not called dysphoria reduction tips. They are not called how to look and feel more like a man. They are called passing tips because they are intended to make you pass. And in most trans men, they simply do not deliver on that promise. They didn't do so for me, and they didn't do so for any of the trans men that I have talked to about this subject. That's what I mean when I say that pre-T passing is a myth. Trans men have a long history of believing that the ability to pass is just about having the correct gender expression. We tend to believe that an estrogen-dominant puberty is going to result in a blank slate body that people only perceive as female because of what clothes you put on it, and it's just not true. Estrogen is a powerful hormone. It has dramatic effects on how you look and how you sound that are not realistically possible for most of us to conceal with just clothing and behavior training. Are there trans men who pass without going on hormones? Sure, but their ability to do so is heavily contingent on already having a certain amount of ambiguity in their physiological features, or living in an environment where people just don't notice that as much. That's great for them, and I'm not saying that they didn't put a lot of effort into passing, but it's just not realistically possible for most trans men to do that without at minimum going on hormones. Why is this important? Because trans guys who are just discovering who they are and just coming out as trans have long wound up being shuffled straight into resources that place a lot of emphasis on passing, and especially passing tips. There are a lot of older websites out there especially that still pop up very high in searches when you Google stuff like how to transition F to M. And it was really standard when these websites were built to either have a passing tips section or link to something like f2mpassingtips.com. Even if you didn't rely on static websites at all and used social media instead, the passing tips sensibility readily carried over almost verbatim to those media, and you can even find a lot of cases in which people have just copied and pasted stuff from old passing tips websites into things like Reddit and Facebook forums. So it's very easy for newer trans men to become indoctrinated into the idea that the ability to pass as a cis man is a question of effort, of grit and determination, determination of pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps rather than the reality, which is that most of us simply don't pass without hormones, and the ones who do are lucky, not skilled. And this is where we come to why this is so toxic. Trans men who are at their most vulnerable stage of transition read these lists and think they're getting valuable information about how to achieve their dreams, but what they're really getting is a convenient point-by-point list of things that they're supposed to be self-conscious about now. If you wear this, people will think you're a woman. If you stand like this, people will think you're a woman. Have you tried manspreading more or dressing more conservatively? Don't you dare wear that. Put down the leather jacket. Do you want people to think you're a butch lesbian? Fuck things like pronoun pins. Those are for losers who don't pass. And I'm being a bit over the top with my sarcasm here, but the idea that you should never need to correct people and that you should just be so obviously manly and masculine that people get it right the first time is a real perspective a lot of trans men develop. And because people encounter this stuff pretty early in transition, they're getting told this before they even really have the opportunity to think about things like what kind of man they actually want to be or what really triggers their gender dysphoria. Instead, they get indoctrinated into the idea that individual personal expression is a privilege you only get once you go on hormones. That can be really explicit too. There's one popular list out there that says that you cannot wear a flannel plaid shirt unless you have been on T long enough for you to have a full beard, because again, you are supposed to be aggressively distinguishing yourself from butch lesbians, and we all know that butch lesbians dress exactly the same as sitcom lesbians from when Crystal Pepsi first debuted. Actual butch lesbian fashion trends definitely don't overlap significantly with trans men's, right? So circling back to the earring story, I liked my earrings, that's why I was wearing them and why they have only increased in both size and power over the past 10 years. Putting them in after that 2-year hiatus was taking back a piece of expression that I'd only removed because I'd felt obligated to, and taking them back out made zero difference in helping me pass. So what was the point of taking them out? There was none, it was pointless. Anyway, as I explained earlier, the deciding factor for whether or not a trans man passes is typically going to be biology and not expression. So what happens when you've already tried all of the passing tips that Tumblr and ex-GeoCities static websites have to offer? Well, it turns out you're in luck, because there are loads of trans men out there who are just itching to tell you all of the ways that you are bad at being a man. And this is where we get to the fantastically toxic world of passing tips forums. These are places where trans men post photographs of themselves so that strangers who they have never met can tell them if they pass or not, and if not, why. Forums dedicated to this often have rules proclaiming that you must be honest about whether or not people pass, and that there is no quote-unquote hugboxing allowed, because historically a lot of trans people have used passing tips forums in order to fish for compliments because they needed a confidence boost, and the last thing that anybody needs is confident trans people who don't pass. Just how harmful these spaces are varies, so if you frequented passing tips forums, your mileage may vary a lot from what I'm going to describe here. The bulk of the forums I went to when I was writing this are on the less toxic side, but since this YouTube channel is a space of honesty and there is no hugboxing allowed here, I would like to assert that I genuinely do not believe that it's possible to have a space dedicated to passing tips that isn't on some level harmful. Because the idea that you can life hack your way into passing is inherently based on a false premise, which again is that if you don't pass, it's because you're doing or wearing something that is causing you to not pass. This frames the inability to pass as a personal failure, and almost nobody really questions that framing in these forums. The people posting pictures tend to be on the younger side, and they're typically pre-T, and they don't pass because of the ravages of estrogen. And hands down, they're being told that the reason they don't pass is not because of the ravages of estrogen, but the fact that they wear jewelry, or that they're dyeing their hair the wrong color, or that their clothing is wrong, or some other expression-related thing like that. When it comes to those physiological barriers that are really responsible for why they aren't passing, people tend to either ignore those or somehow find a way to blame them on expression. Recently I saw the most perfect chef's kiss example of this. A younger trans man, probably in his mid-teens, maybe late teens, posted a photo of himself asking if he passes, and people were telling him, "No, you don't pass. You should stop wearing makeup." Why did they think that he was wearing makeup? Well, estrogen affects your face. It makes it prettier. This is why some prescription face creams have estrogen in them. If you want a great illustration of what estrogen can do to a face, I went off of testosterone for 3 years, and if you look at what my face looks like when I haven't been on testosterone for 3 years, you may very well think that I'm wearing makeup, but I'm not. In the case of the boy in the Passing Tips forums, people could tell that his face was very feminine, but because Passing Tips lore chronically frames the inability to pass as a failure to cultivate the correct gender expression, they assumed that he must have done something to make his face look that way. There must be some way that this is his fault, and this is a bit of foreshadowing here, but how do you think this trans boy is going to feel about his face going forward? They potentially just planted an insecurity in him that he did not have before. I'm gonna briefly switch gears here because I have been around the trans community for a long time, and I don't want to imply that there have been no positive changes in how we handle this issue compared to the almost 20 years ago that I started transitioning. Nowadays, there is a lot less obligation to try passing. It's well known that there are trans men out there who simply do not care if they pass, or who strive to dress however they want. You may find a lot of people who are very pro trans men wearing dresses and stuff like that. This is great, but it also portrays non-passing trans men as making a choice not to pass. It does nothing to challenge the extremely bootstrapsy idea that we all could pass with enough grit and determination if we really want to. And this is where we get to what I was saying about how Passing Tips cause trans men to develop insecurities that they may not have had before. Anyway, this video is kind of a remake. I told the earring story and posted it a long time ago, and then I had to take it down and redo it for the most peak trans reason, which is that the friend in the story reached out to me, and it turns out my cis male best friend in college is not. So I needed to change some pronouns and reflect on what the set of events actually meant there. And in that process, I also realized that I had forgotten to talk about the original reason for even thinking about this subject, which was not a 15-year-old story about being criticized for wearing earrings. It actually was my early midlife crisis that I went through a couple of years ago. So here's what happened. After I went back on hormones, I started losing a lot of hair. Like, it was coming out almost in clumps in the shower. And while it wasn't really that serious, at the time I was devastated. I was convinced that I was eminently going to go Danny DeVito level bald, and I was actively causing myself both physical and psychological damage trying to prevent that from happening. I became so stressed out over it that I was pricing out whether it would be more cost effective for me to get hair transplant surgery or get facial masculinization surgery. Now, these are both fine and valid surgeries, and I have not even truthfully taken either of them off of the table, but how did facial masculinization surgery, which has nothing to do with how much hair I have on my head, even factor into this equation? The answer is that when I was still pre-T, I deeply absorbed the belief that I needed to hide the shape of my skull. If I didn't hide my skull, it would emphasize the femininity of the rest of my face. If you look at f2mpassingtips.com, that classic document that's so old that it tells you to use a monotype font so that it preserves the ASCII drawings within it, it says in no uncertain terms that if you don't have enough hair up top, such as if you get a crew cut, it will emphasize the shape of your skull and make you look like Sinead O'Connor. This advice still comes up whenever somebody pops into a Passing Tips forum who has a buzz cut or other very short haircut, almost verbatim to what you find on f2mpassingtips.com, and it's because we all learned this advice from the same goddamn place. Mind you, I never had hair that was short enough to really show me what the shape of my head was. My head shape was not a thing that I would ever have been made aware of had I not spent so much time reading these Passing Tips lists when I was pre-T. But because some guy who probably had a kick-ass collection of Pog Slammers at the time once wrote that trans men have lady skulls that we need to hide under a traditional back and sides haircut, I was overcome with fear that having male pattern baldness was going to cause people to clock me as trans or even start misgendering me again. And if that happened, I would need to have surgical intervention to change the shape of my face to offset it. After an embarrassing amount of time trying to deal with this, probably almost a year, I had suddenly become extremely aware of why I was feeling this way. I'd been asking myself, why are you so reticent to just try shaving your head if you lose too much hair? Bald man with beard is a fairly popular style right now. Why are you stressing out over it and spending so much money and effort on it? And I realized that it's because I'm insecure about my skull shape. It dawned on me that I'd never actually seen the shape of my skull. I'd just been told by some guy who had not experienced the horrors of a post 9/11 society that this was a thing I needed to worry about. I realized at that point that not only did I not know what my head shape really looked like, I'd been assuming for over a full decade that my head is smaller than it is. In fact, I have been chronically buying hats that are too small for me because of this. So I did shave my head shortly after. Here's a picture of what that looks like. And I was just ripping the band-aid off to remind myself that I was a 35-year-old man with a beard and that nobody was going to call me she if I buzzed my head. And while I had a good laugh about how my head shape is fine and looks nothing like I thought it would, it was also extremely eye-opening. The thing is, I know some of you may argue that the only reason that this advice is irrelevant to me is because I'm on testosterone now, and now I am free to shave my head as short as I want because the tea will take care of it. There are two massive problems with this. First, trans men have every right to express themselves however they want, even if they aren't on testosterone yet. That doesn't just include past tense me. It includes every trans man who is pre-T today. Why shouldn't a trans guy have a buzz cut or wear earrings if he likes it? Who the hell cares? Second, it implies that if I hadn't been on testosterone when this happened, this would have been something that made a huge difference in my ability to pass, and that's just not true. The fact of the matter is this: if I had gone into a hair salon with a photograph of literally Sinead O'Connor and said, I want this exact haircut, I would have passed exactly as well as I did before when I was picking my haircuts based on what everybody said would help me pass. I never passed using that advice anyway. I would have gone from not passing to not passing but with a buzz cut. After this experience, I began to wonder how many other trans men are going through a similar thing, being inadvertently set up to be insecure over things that either were never the culprit to begin with, or that they can't control anyway, just because the first resources they encountered while transitioning convinced them that wearing this kind of shirt, or cutting their hair like that, or holding their books the wrong way, was going to be the difference between being seen as a man and being seen as a woman. And I can't stress enough, the problem is not only that people might feel insecure because of passing tips. Sometimes constructive criticism hurts feelings. That's just a fact of life we all contend with. But passing tips are not constructive criticism. They manufacture things to be insecure about and then provide solutions that don't work. So you develop those insecurities for no reason at all. So I've talked for however many minutes about why this is a problem, and if you're with me this far, you might be wondering what we can do to change or mitigate this environment. First, if you're watching this video and you are currently pre-T and just now learning that maybe passing isn't going to be in the cards for you right now, I want to just mention what I wish I had done more when I wasn't on hormones yet. I kind of wasted a lot of time picking what I wore and how I presented based on the pipe dream of potentially passing, when I should have just been working on developing a wardrobe and a style that I was really into. Recently I was joking that I wasted the ideal time to have a heavy goth phase dressing like an early 90s conservative dweeb, and it didn't even fucking work. So instead of dressing with the intent to pass as a cis man, my suggestion, if this is safe for you, in your current situation, is if you're looking for men's fashion advice, get that from sources intended for cis men who have a fashion sense that you find appealing. You should really only be using passing tips type stuff for troubleshooting your own dysphoria. It's fine, of course, if you, I guess, hope that you're an exception and that these things work to help you pass, just don't assume that they will. They very often don't. One thing that I would have done more if it were as mainstream as it is now is I would have really leaned into things like pronoun pins. These weren't really a thing when I came out, but they would have made everything a whole lot better for me. Really just use that resource, again, if it's safe for you. Next, things you can do to improve the environment of the trans community with regard to this problem if it maybe isn't relevant to you anymore. I don't feel it's constructive to individually talk to trans men who are trying to pass to convince them that it isn't going to work. Believe me, I am often tempted. when I see somebody being told that their expression is the problem when it isn't, I just want to DM them telling them that their earrings and hair aren't the problem, you dress fine. But I know that if somebody had done that to me at that stage in transition, I would never have interpreted that as, oh, actually almost nobody passes before hormones. I would have thought you were picking on me specifically. So instead, what I want to see is the perspective of the trans community as a whole to shift on this subject. The fact that reliably passing before hormones is rare should be one of those things that is talked about and becomes common knowledge. In my ideal future, pre-T passing tips resources would be looked upon as just a weird thing trans men used to do before we knew any better, like take the Cogiati test or call gay trans men tranny fags as if that's a value-neutral descriptor and not like a collection of slurs. Remember back in the day when we used to listen to anonymous GeoCities websites telling us that we were looking at our fingernails the wrong way and that we couldn't get buzz cuts because we would look like 90s pop icon Sinead O'Connor? Man, I'm glad we don't do that dumb shit anymore. Will that fantasy ever become reality? I guess only time will tell, but dear reader, I cannot make that happen alone. How do we achieve that? I want people who used these resources and found them to be unhelpful to be open about that, especially if you've developed long-term insecurities because of it. If you're somebody like me who has been transitioning for literal decades, you probably at least occasionally are in the position where trans men who are newer to the community and newer to transition are asking you questions about transitioning. In a couple of weeks, I'll be appearing on a panel where I talk about transitioning in the workplace. And the fact that I couldn't pass before hormones is very relevant to my workplace transition. If it comes up, I will absolutely talk about that experience. If you didn't pass before hormones and pre-T trans guys are asking you how to pass better, how are you responding to that? Are you pointing out a bunch of things in their expression that you think are too feminine? Are you giving them links to websites that you habitually use without considering whether or not they really benefited you, or parroting advice from those same resources? Or are you honestly saying, well, I actually never did pass before I went on hormones, most of us don't, and redirecting them to things like pronoun pins and focusing on mitigating their own dysphoria? If relevant to the individual situation, are you helping them to get on hormones so that they don't have to deal with that in the future? These are just things to think about if you are in agreement with what I'm saying here, that this is a problem that we should be working on. Anyway, that's all for today. Until next time, happy trails.